Hello, my name is Trinity MacArthur, and I am a second year student at Penn State Dickinson Law and am participating in the Manglona Lab for Gender and Economic Equity. For one of the lab's projects, Witnesses to Herstory, we are capturing the personal experiences of women in education, sports, and the workforce during a dynamic era in the United States. Today, I have the privilege of interviewing Lois Lowry, author, photographer, and inspiration, who has written countless children's books that you may well remember, such as Number of the Stars and The Giver. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Trinity. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So let's start from the beginning. When were you born?
I was born in 1937, March.
And where were you born?
I was born in Honolulu, which at that time was not a state. It was the territory of Honolulu. And that's what it says on my birth certificate. And interestingly, also on my birth certificate, there's a place where it asks for the occupation of both parents, father and mother. And it gives uh, a little list of ones that might be selected. And under father, and my father was an army dentist, it lists farmer, shopkeeper, lawyer as possibilities. And under mother, it lists secretary, housewife. Those were the options back in 1937. And my mother would have put in housewife.
That's
Though
very interesting.
I will add that my mother had been a teacher before she married, but she never worked again after she married.
But there was no option for a teacher on the birth certificate, just
I
secretary or
don't, I don't
housewife.
recall. I don't recall that there was.
So who lived in your house growing up?
Well, because of my father's profession, I lived in many, many houses. So, who lived in my house when I was born? Of course, I don't remember this. This is only hearsay and what was told to me by my mother, who was a great keeper of the past and recounter of the past. My father was not. So, my father had been transferred by the Army to Hawaii at some time prior to my birth. I don't know if my mother was pregnant at that time, but they already had, when I was born, a 3-year-old daughter. So, living in our household when I was born was mother and father, 3-year-old daughter, and new baby me, plus a woman whose name I have never known, though it's one of those questions I should have asked my parents, and we don't ask in time, and then they're gone, and we can never ask. But there are pictures of what they referred to as my nursemaid, a woman, Asian woman, Japanese, Hawaiian, hard to tell from just looking at her. And she's holding baby me. And I believe she lived in our house. But also during that time, my grandmother, who was a widow and a Norwegian immigrant in Wisconsin, where my father had grown up, came alone across the country by train in 1937 and then took a ship to Hawaii. And she lived with us during my earliest years. And my earliest memories always include that grandmother.
Um,
When we returned to the States when I was 3, my grandmother went back to Wisconsin. So she never lived with us again. But she's a very formative person in my past because of those 3 years.
were other households in your community, did they also have nursemaids and grandmothers living with them?
I don't know that, but we were living on a military reservation outside of Honolulu. And we were in military housing. We actually had, I know because of old home movies, I've seen it, a very pleasant looking, smallish house. But it was identical probably to everyone of my father's rank. Such housing on military establishments is always done by rank. And as my father rose to a high rank in the military, we always had the big house on the Army post. But at the time that I was born, he would have been probably a captain. And so our house was modest but not unattractive, and it did have beautiful gardens around it. And my guess is that the other houses of people of equal rank were very similar. And my guess is also that probably if they had small babies, they probably also had a nursemaid because that was the custom at the time. And I think it was probably a reputable occupation for young women to take on that job.
So after you lived in Honolulu, you moved to a bunch of different places. You moved to New York and Carlisle, and then to Tokyo for a little bit, and then back to Carlisle and on to New York. So what was it like growing up, moving to so many different places in your childhood?
Well, I never knew anything else, so I had nothing to compare it to with this exception. We had returned from Honolulu to New York. I don't know what my father's job was in New York. I was too little to care about that. I probably never asked, Daddy, what do you do when you go off each day? But we were living there, and I was 4 years old, and I remember the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed. I remember my mother hearing it on the radio. It was a Sunday, and uh, and my father was outside, and my mother ran to the front door and called to him. And what I remember hearing her call was something about what she'd heard on the radio, but also you have to come in and put your uniform on. It was a Sunday, and Dad would have worn civilian clothes on Sundays, but of course he wore a uniform to work every day. And I've never known, is that a false memory? Did they announce on the radio that everybody serving in the military had to be in uniform on that Sunday? I don't know the answer to that. But once the war began, Dad very soon had to leave. He went for further training in Indiana, I remember. I don't know what he did in Indiana, but from there he went to the Pacific. He was on a hospital ship during the war. And so my mother, who was by then pregnant with a third child, um, took my sister and me back to Pennsylvania, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, small college town, home of Dickinson College and Dickinson Law School, I should add. And my grandfather was the president of Carlisle Trust Company Bank. He was a banker. He had a large house on College Street, right across from the campus of Dickinson College and Law School. And we moved at first into my grandparents' house. I'm guessing, and my baby brother was born while we lived in that house. I remember I was 5 years old at the time, but I do remember the feeling of importance telling my friends that Grandpa had sent a telegram to Daddy. I had no idea what a telegram was, but it seemed like an important set of events. Daddy being notified that he had a son. And so when my brother was still a baby, a, a house very close by my grandparents, still on College Street, became available for rent, and we moved there. I think that was probably a happy occasion for my grandmother, who had been the matriarch of a large and quiet household, and suddenly the daughter and the babies all moved in, and so she was probably delighted when we moved down the street. But for that period of time, I began first grade from that house in Carlisle, and I went through sixth grade. I skipped second grade, so that meant I was there in elementary school for 5 years. And those were the years during the war. It's interesting to me to think back on it now that I don't recall any other children having fathers who were gone because of the war, but mine, of course, was. And that set me apart in an odd way. Any rate, so, but that was the only period in my life in which I had a stationary home for an extended period. After the war ended, I've forgotten what question you asked me, and I feel so I'm going on too long. But you asked, I guess, where I had lived. After the war ended, well, Dad came home briefly from Japan. He had entered Japan at the end after the bomb was dropped. He was among the first to enter Japan, and he was to stay in Japan. But he was able to come home on leave and meet his baby son for the first time. But then he went back to Japan, and we waited until the appropriate orders were given that we could join him there. And by then, I had just finished sixth grade, and I had just turned, my birthday's in the spring. I had just turned 11 years old. So that summer, we I don't remember how we got to New York, but we got on a ship in New York and went by ship down through the Panama Canal up to San Francisco, where we stopped for a few days, I guess, to take additional people aboard, and then across the Pacific. And it took a month to get to Yokohama, where Dad met us and drove us to Tokyo, which is very close by, and to our new home. And I remember him whispering to me in the car, or as we were getting in the car, that he had a surprise for me. And the surprise was a bicycle. He had bought me a green bicycle, which later that green bicycle figured in one of my books. But then I was in Tokyo I entered seventh grade there, age 11. That's young for seventh grade, but I had skipped second grade, so I was a year behind my classmates in age. So I went through seventh grade, went through eighth grade, had my 13th birthday, and then the Korean War began. That was July, if I remember correctly, of 1950. I came home, it was the middle of summer. I came home one day from the swimming pool where I hung out with my pals. Tokyo had built a huge venue for the Olympics before the war began, and then the Olympics could never be held there. But the place still existed, and the Olympic swimming pool was there, and we kids could go there, and we spent half the summer at that pool. I came home from the pool one afternoon, and Mother was packing, and she said, "We're going back to the States." My father couldn't come. They were bringing casualties in from Korea, and he was on the staff of the hospital in Tokyo. So we returned. My grandmother must have not loved it. Here they come again. Moved back in with the grandparents until we found a house for rent, and we stayed there until Dad could get home. And then we moved to New York City, where I finished high school. So, as I say, I've forgotten the question, but that was a lengthy answer, which I hope answered it to some degree.
Yes, it did. So in going to school in Carlisle and then Tokyo and then in New York for high school, did you ever notice a difference in the way that boys and girls were treated in these different geographic locations?
Okay, let me go back to elementary school. In those days, I don't know when this ended, but when I was in elementary school, in a public school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the Franklin building, which was the elementary school, had several entrances, and one was the boys' entrance and one was the girls' entrance. And the playground was divided. And when recess came twice a day, incidentally, we walked to school, recess in the middle of the morning, 15 minutes. Then we walked home for lunch, walked back to school, recess in the middle of the afternoon. The girls, there was a girls' playground and a boys' playground. And I'm guessing that the boys probably played, boyish games, various kinds of ball games, I'm guessing. And we girls played the girls' games, hopscotch, jump rope, things like that. So that was a difference. I don't recall any particular difference in the classroom. though if I think longer, I may come up with something. So then I go off to Japan, and there is not that division of playground or doors. But my school in Japan was somewhat unique. I mean, this is a country that had just been devastated in a war. Tokyo had been badly bombed. This school was still standing, but it had been there for many, many years. And it was an international school with instruction, teaching done in English. I did, during my years there, learn a little Japanese, but I could never have competed in a Japanese language school. So, uh, thinking back to gender differences at that time in Tokyo, nothing comes to my mind except the things that were typical of the time. There was boys' stuff and girls' stuff. And to a certain degree, when my own children are growing up, that was still true and perhaps still is. But I don't recall anything that would have been discriminatory in any way. Our teachers were by and large female. And I'm now thinking why that would have been. I think they were probably, during those days of the American occupation, probably a lot of the teachers were drawn from military wives who had teaching credentials. Uh, uh, I don't know that. That's just my guess. I don't remember having any male teachers in Tokyo. Interesting. When I returned to Pennsylvania, though, I then entered, I was entering ninth grade. I was 13 years old. And I was placed in the public school in Carlisle. At that time, there was junior high and senior high. And junior high was seventh, eighth, and ninth grade. And then senior high, my sister was 3 years older, was 10th, 11th, and 12th. And so at that time, I did have male teachers. And again, there was just the typical boy-girl difference, which in retrospect, I can't identify anything that felt at that time or that feels in retrospect discriminatory. Just the usual boys do this and girls do that, and that's sort of always been true. And when I had children, I had two of each, two boys and two girls, and that was true in our household. There was my kids were born all in 5 years. So there was girl, boy, a year apart, and then girl, boy, a year apart. And we used to refer to them, we being my husband and I, as the big kids and the little kids, even though they were 5, 4, 2, and 1. Or we would refer to them as the boys and the girls. A natural distinction, I think, and without any prejudice, I suppose.
Um, how did it feel to transition from a school with divided entrances and divided playgrounds to one without those divisions?
You know, my transition from sixth grade to seventh was a transition to a different country. And so there was so much that was new to me and different that I don't recall what you described as being anything of a surprise. The transition from sixth grade to seventh grade was also a large one and would have been had I stayed in Carlisle, because it would have been going from elementary school to junior high school, different building, more grown up. So those were the changes that that affected me more than any changes having to do with gender, I think. But I forgot to mention that when I returned to Carlisle for ninth grade, and then Dad comes home from Tokyo, and we moved to New York. At that point, my parents had always, they were products of public school, and they sent their children to public school. And when we moved to New York, it was to an island down by the Statue of Liberty. First Army headquarters was on this little island, and that's where I lived. And so my parents enrolled me in there was a school on the island for my brother. It went up through sixth grade, or through eighth grade, I guess. But I had to go into New York to school, and my parents enrolled me in a public school because that's what they had always done. And I spent one semester there. And that having nothing to do with gender, really, but that was a very difficult transition because I was scared a lot. There were very scary kids at that school, and I wasn't accustomed to that. I came from a small town, and suddenly these are New York kids, and there are gangs, and it was scary. So for my junior and senior years, my parents transferred me to a private school, and it happened to be all girls. The same school still exists, but it's now co-ed and has been for years. But during my 2 years there, I was at a girls' school, and I loved it. And I think part of what I loved, there were many things that I loved, and one was the academic experience, coming from a New York public school that had to address a broad spectrum of students to a somewhat, I hate the word, but elitist school that drew on a certain educated class of families. The academics were so superior, and that appealed to me and made me very happy. But also, I'm not sure I thought about this specifically at the time, but I certainly do in retrospect. There was being only with girls in the classroom made a difference. And I realize now, looking back, that there was always the awareness of the difference of gender. And I don't know if I was intimidated by boys. Boys weren't smarter than me, but they were tougher than me or something. They were more powerful than me. And so suddenly I was in a group, and a small group in my entire class, junior and then senior, there were 30 some girls. We were all equal to each other. There were no power struggles having to do with gender or anything else. So that was a very happy experience for me, and it made me, when I began looking at colleges, made me look at female colleges, all girl colleges, and then I entered into a battle with my parents over college, but it had nothing to do with gender. It's just that my sister had gone to Penn State, ta-da, and they were legal residents of Pennsylvania. Although we had lived all over, an Army officer has to maintain a legal residence, and ours was Pennsylvania. So the tuition was less for my sister, and my father assumed, and now I'm beginning to feel, yes, there was some gender discrimination here within our family. My father assumed wrongly that I would happily go to Penn State where my sister was. And I didn't want to because, well, my sister majored in home economics, and that suited her well. She was a duplicate of our mother. Her goal in life was to be a wife and mother. And I had by then begun to have academic aspirations that were far different from my sister's. And I went to visit her at Penn State. She lived in her sorority. I think they had a floor of a dorm or something. But at any rate, and I realized that's not what I wanted to do. So my father said, "Of course you're going to Penn State." And I said, "Of course I'm not." And we entered into a fixed battle. It's not easy for a 16-year-old girl to battle with an army colonel, but I won that one because Pembroke, which is where I ended up, offered me a scholarship. My father was so amazed. Why do they want to give you money? I said, because they want me as a student, Dad. Anyway, so that's where I went. Now, by the time I went to college, and I will add this, I thought that I was going to a women's college, and technically I was, but it was like Radcliffe and Harvard. Pembroke was part of Brown. Radcliffe no longer exists. Pembroke no longer exists because they merged into the greater university. But I went there with the idea of wanting to go to a women's college. Our classes, however, were all with Brown, so there was complete integration of the students, but our living situation was separate. By the time I went to college, my father had been transferred to Washington, D.C., and so they moved there the summer before I went to college, but I was away working at a summer job in a hotel in the Pocono Mountains. And so when I came home before going to college, I was in a house I'd never seen before, surrounded by neighbors whom I'd never met. And almost immediately, I packed up my suitcase, and my father drove me to Union Station and put me on a train, and off I went to Providence to college. My parents never set foot on that campus, never saw the college that I went to. Seems odd to me now, but I think they were still, not my mother, but my dad was still pissed off that I was going to that highfalutin college. What was I doing that? Uh, and so then I ended up at Pembroke, which was a women's college within the greater uh, territory of Brown University.
What was your major when you were at Brown?
I had chosen Brown because it had at that time, I mean, this is a zillion years ago, and I don't know that this particular thing lasted all that long, but it had a special program for people studying writing. And I had been accepted into that program. It was called English Expression, just a pseudonym for writing. And they also had a special program at that time at Brown called the IC curriculum. And some students, both male and female, had been selected for that. And I was one of those. The I and C stood for identification and criticism. And it meant those classes were not the typical large lecture classes that many college classes were. They were small seminars, and they were very exciting to me. I mean, I loved my academic experience. One, I'd been admitted to this writing program, which was mostly for upperclassmen, and I was just a freshman, and a very young freshman at that, 17 years old. And so I was in that, but I was also in these IC classes, which were highly academic. And all of that was so exhilarating to me. None of that, now that I'm thinking about it, really reflects anything having to do with gender. Although I do recall in those writing seminars, there were guys, they'd be small. So I'd be in a room around a table with maybe 8 students and a professor. And maybe 6 of those students would be male. And of those male students, some, I can remember the names of some of them, were veterans from the Korean War. And so they were older. They'd been off to war and come back. And so they had an aura to them that they'd experienced more. And that was not my imagination. That was certainly true. And they were separate from and other than others of us, particularly those others of us who were 17-year-old girls in knee socks. I just look back at myself in my imagination and kind of chuckle because I was so young and so naive. Uh, but
When you were in college, now that it was co-ed again, did you feel those same power struggles that you had felt previously in your public school that was co-ed?
to a certain extent, and I'll tell you a little anecdote that just occurs to me, and this is very telling, I think. When I went to college, and now I've come out of a girls' school, so I'd never really dated. There had not been the dating scene that there would have been in a public high school. So now I'm in college, and there are, at that time, I might have the numbers a little wrong, but I think 700 females and 3,000 guys. So if you needed a date for Saturday night, it was not a problem because five guys would call you up. They were competing at any rate. So I almost immediately acquired a boyfriend, and he was 2 years ahead of me. So that meant that when he graduated 2 years later, I was completing my sophomore year, and he assumed, thought, hoped that we would get married. He'd been in the ROTC. He was going to be a naval officer, so we would get married. And to me, that seemed the obvious thing to do. I mean, it seems so foolish now, but that's what I did. Okay. And so I dropped out of college, end of my sophomore year, got married a week later, and off we went to California where he was a naval officer. Okay. In those days, when you took your final exams, you you had a blue book. I don't know if this is still true. You would write your exam answers in this blue book, and you would include a postcard addressed to yourself. And then on the other side, you would write grade for exam blank, grade for course blank. And you would go home at the end of the school, and a few days later, the postcard would arrive and it would tell you what grade you'd gotten in the course. Okay, so I went home. Oh, I jumped over something. My boyfriend, though he was 2 years older, and though he was not an English major as I was, he took a course my sophomore year. He was a senior. He enrolled in a course that I was taking. English 32, it was called. I don't remember the specific topic, but we took that same course. Okay, so the semester ends, we get married, we go to California. The postcards are forwarded to our address in California. I was home alone when the mail arrived that day, and there are two postcards, one addressed to me and one addressed to my husband. And mine said grade for exam A, grade for course A. And his said grade for exam B, grade for course B. And so I tore his up and put it in the trash. And to the extent that he ever asked about it, I would say, I don't know. They never came. I guess because we moved to California, they never reached us. I was afraid to tell him that my grade had been higher than his. What do I think he would have done? I mean, I don't know. He wouldn't have beat me up or anything, but I just I was worried about his ego, I guess. I haven't thought about that in years, and it just occurred to me as you were asking the questions. It was kind of a bizarre thing. What was the big deal? So I did, it was my field of study, not his. I should have gotten a better grade than he, but I was scared to tell him.
So from there, as you mentioned, you had four children, and you did not begin working for a little bit. When did you begin writing for magazines and things of that sort?
Okay, we've got to make some jumps here. As I mentioned, he was in the Navy. He had a 3-year commitment in the Navy, as I recall. and he extended it for 1 year. But his plan was always to go to law school after he finished his Navy commitment. He extended it for a year because he joined the submarine service, which paid more money. I mean, the pay was terrible anyway for a low-ranking officer. But by the time he started law school, we had 2 small children. And while he was in law school, a student, we had 2 more children. So we had 4 by the time he graduated. I had always wanted to be a writer, and it's what I had pursued in college and done well in at college. But then I was caught up in being a mother of 4 very small children. And also, we had very little money. And so he's a student now. We moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he's a student at Harvard Law School. And we live in a crummy apartment. The rent was $90 a month. And I tried a couple of times to take courses. I still had my old academic aspirations, but I mean, I felt like such a failure when I dropped out of both those courses. Looking back on it, I think, how could you have possibly done that? You had 4 children under the age of 4.5, and you think you're going to study Russian at Harvard at the same time. Of course, you're not going to be able to do that. So in both cases, I dropped out of the courses I was taking. So I kept the hope, the dream, the aspiration, but it took me a while to get around to it. When my husband finished law school, and incidentally, when he was in Harvard Law School, he was the class of 1963. I think there were 3 women in his class. One of them was Janet Reno, who went on to become Attorney General of the United States. Now, if I'm correct, and I think I am, there are either an equal number or perhaps more women than men at Harvard Law School in any given class. But at that time, it was a very small number. So he finishes law school and takes a job in Maine, and we moved to Maine. And my children are very small. The youngest is an infant. The oldest is entering kindergarten. I waited until the youngest child went to kindergarten, and then I went back to school. And it was exhilarating to be using my brain again. I loved having kids. I was a good mom, I think, to little kids, but it does not require a lot of brains to be a good mom to little kids. And when I went back to school, and I was, of course, an older student by then. Let me think. My youngest child was born in 1962. So say he was 5 years old when I went back to school. That makes it 1967. And I would have been 30 years old at that time. So I was an older student. And I just fell in love with being back in school and studying. So, and you asked when I started writing. I had 2 years of college to finish, and I couldn't go full time with a household and kids. And so it took me 4 years to get my undergraduate degree, and then I continued on to graduate school. When I was in graduate school, I began writing professionally. And when it came time to write my master's thesis, I decided against doing it because I was already writing articles for magazines and newspapers, and editors were coming to me and giving me assignments, things to write. And yet I was supposed to write this boring thesis in order to get the master's degree. And so I became a dropout once again. And I will just add there came a time, and it was many years later, when I got a phone message asking me to call the office of the president of the University of Southern Maine. And I thought, oh, God, they've just realized I never finished that master's degree, that thesis. They're coming after me. But I called the number, and it turns out they were calling me to tell me they were giving me an honorary degree. Kind of funny. But at any rate, so I dropped out of my master's program. And by that time, I was in my 30s, probably late 30s. What I had always wanted to do was to write fiction. But fiction has always been more difficult to sell, to market than nonfiction. So I was writing a lot of articles for substantial publications, but it wasn't fiction. And I should add, in graduate school, I had studied photography. And so I'd set up a darkroom and I was able to do the photographs for articles. Then in 19, I don't know, 70 something, 74 perhaps, I did sell a short story to a magazine. In those days, there were still magazines that published short stories. That's almost not true now. There are very few now, but in those days, there were more. And so I published this story in, I think, 1974 or 5. And although it was a story for adults, it was told through the eyes of a child. And a children's book editor from a major publisher read it and got in touch with me and said, would you consider writing a book for young people? And so that's when I wrote my first book. And it was published. They didn't promise to publish it, but it was unusual to have an editor who had asked for it and who was waiting to read it, so that I didn't have to. The typical path to publication is you send them something and then they send you a rejection letter 6 months later. But they did publish that first book. And by the time that was published, I was 40. So it was a long road to getting to publishing fiction.
Um, Before we get into your writing career, I noticed that you graduated from undergrad. You finished your undergraduate degree in 1972 and then went on to graduate school. 1972 is the same year that Title IX was passed, which guarantees equality of sex in education. Did you notice any difference between your undergraduate education, graduate education, or maybe your children's education?
I noticed no difference whatsoever in my own education. But perhaps that may have been because I was so focused on what I was learning in my courses that I paid absolutely no attention to anything else. However, when my own children began school, and I'm not familiar with what happened legally in 19, whatever year it was, you said. But I'm just remembering that my first child was a daughter, and she was the one who, when she became, starting seventh, eighth, or seventh grade and up, she became the gender rebel. For one thing, I am no longer a churchgoer, but at that time, we went to the Episcopal Church every Sunday, and our kids went to the Episcopal Sunday school. And my daughter noticed that there were boys who were called acolytes who marched in the processional carrying the whatever down the aisle of the church each Sunday. And she said, why aren't there girls? And I said, I don't know. Why don't you ask them? And so she fought, and she became the first female acolyte in that particular Episcopal church. At about the same time, at her high school, they had in addition, as my kids went to a very good public high school in Maine, one of allegedly the two best public high schools in Maine. They had very good academic courses, but they also had uh, gender related courses. And I guess the girls took cooking or sewing or something. And my daughter announced that she was going to take car mechanics, and she had to fight the administration of the school, but she won, and so she was also the first the on the barricades on that gender issue in her school. So I'm trying to recall if there were the typical male female distinctions in my kids' schools, which hadn't been in mine since I went to an all girls school. Uh, and if my kids were here answering this question, they would come up with specific answers to your question and things they observed. But I think they fought those battles without a whole lot of help from their mother, because I was busy going to school myself, and I paid attention to my kids, but I didn't I don't recall being involved in any of that kind of uh, situation with them, except I probably had to sign the permission slip for my daughter to become a car mechanic.
So in 1977, you published your first book, A Summer to Die, and I know that you also divorced your first husband that year. Was there a difference between being a writer when you were married versus when you were divorced, and also still having some children?
I think I think there were probably gender-related situations that led to the failure of my first marriage. My husband was a lawyer. I had seen him through Harvard Law School. And then I was what was known as a law wife. And in fact, at Harvard Law School, there was an organization called Law Wives, and we were the wives of the students. I was busy with small children, so I didn't participate much in that, but I was aware of it. But then I move on to Maine, and now I am the wife of a lawyer. And along the way, my husband became at one point a congressional candidate, and I was the wife of, and it was increasingly difficult to play that role because it was in many ways demeaning. Uh, I was continually being introduced as the wife of, and maybe I was overly sensitive to it. But at the same time that that was happening, I was in school and exhilarated by academics. And then when I was in graduate school, I was in demand as a photographer and as a journalist. And again and again, that was in conflict with the stereotype of the lawyer's wife. And I can't fault my husband. I mean, he was a typical person of his time, and he would have wanted me to be the wife who stayed home and produced beautiful dinner parties. And I no longer wanted to do that, nor could I bring myself to do that because I was so exhilarated by the life that was opening up to me on in another realm. And so that contributed to the end of that marriage. I've forgotten what your question was.
Just were there any differences for you as a writer in your career before you were divorced versus afterwards?
Well, okay, when I was divorced, there were a number of things that I had paid no attention to as a wife, as a lawyer's wife. And my husband did not want a divorce, but I did. And so he eventually said he would give me a divorce if I would accede to this list that he had drawn up, and I signed my name to it. And that meant that I gave him the house. I agreed to educate our daughters. He would educate, the list said, our sons. I was allowed to take my clothes, my car, my cameras, my typewriter, 25 books, which I could choose from our bookcases. I mean, it was very demeaning. I was just so eager to start my own life that I signed those papers. Uh, and and I was stupid to do so. And it turned out the paper he had me sign was not legal. There were no witnesses, because I later took it to a lawyer who told me that this is no legal document. But I didn't realize, for example, until I took my car, my typewriter, my cameras, and my clothes and moved into a rented furnished apartment over a garage, leaving him in the 10-room house with the housekeeper. Uh, I didn't realize that I had no bank account. I had never had a credit card. I didn't realize, and he didn't tell me, so I didn't know for a year that I had no medical insurance. So I really struggled to address those inequities. But in retrospect, I don't regret that happened that way, because it really forced me to. If I had, for example, typical of divorces at that time, people would split the proceeds or sell the house, and at any rate, the wife would end up with alimony or child support, which I didn't have. Uh, and if I had had all that, I'm guessing that I would not have worked so hard. But I really, out of necessity, I really had to scramble and make a living, not only make a living, but educate two daughters, one of whom was a student at Vassar at that time. So even though it was not fair, I value the time that I spent trying to make up for those things. So I worked very hard, and I occasionally had to borrow money from friends. I remember a time when my younger daughter was living with me, and she was probably 16, 17. And she complained. And we were living in a rented furnished, we were living in somebody's summer home. And we were there for the winter. They rented it to us $175 a month for the winter. And she complained that we were out of shampoo. She had long blonde hair. And, 17-year-old girl wants to have her beautiful hair washed. There's no shampoo in this house. So I went to the local little mom and pop grocery store, and I didn't have enough money to buy shampoo. I actually, for a brief, fleeting moment, thought, I wonder if I could shoplift a tube of shampoo. And then I thought, no. I went to the store owner, Mr. Bradbury, and asked if I could open a charge account. And he let me. So I charged a tube of shampoo and took it home for my daughter. That was a sidetrack. I've forgotten where I was going with that. But at any rate, those were very tough times. And I had to work very hard, and it was good for me to do so, because I had never really worked hard at anything before. I had played well, I had written for magazines, and I did it well, but I had never had to uh, get something done by the date.
So, as you began writing, were there any women authors that inspired you in your career?
Well, I've always been a reader. Uh, and uh, and there have always been women authors who inspired me. I'd have to look at dates to figure out what I read when, but it was during that time when my kids were young that I believe Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, came out. Well, I'm just gonna ask Siri, when was that published?
I think it came out in 1963.
Okay, that's the year my husband graduated from law school. I wouldn't have read it at that time, but I remember I had young kids when I read it, and that was an eye opener. It was still some years before I broke free of the trap that I felt myself caught in. But there were also novels. I remember this wasn't a novel, this was a nonfiction writer named Jane Howard. And she wrote a book, maybe it was a collection of her essays, I don't remember, called A Different Woman. And when I read it, I felt riveted. I felt a kinship to this woman who was a writer and being who I wanted to be. I envied her. But anyway, I wrote her a letter. It's the first, almost the only time I've ever written to an author. But she never wrote back. Boo-hoo. She's long dead. But at any rate, she was another. But certainly would have been novels that I read. I'm currently reading the autobiography, the memoir of Margaret Atwood. And I don't remember when The Handmaid's Tale came out, but it was much later, I think. But there have always been women writers like that who were a source of not envy, but admiration for me. Uh, I'm not going to come up with specific names at the moment.
So when you write your books, do you consider gender dynamics and how they play out in your stories?
I do. Most of my books have had a female protagonist, and that's simply because it's easier for me to put myself into the mind and heart of a young female. But some have had boys as the main character. And I'd have to think back individually about books, but to varying degrees of that has played a role. I do remember that when I wrote The Giver, which has a male protagonist, but I was creating there a society, a community set somewhat in the future. So I was creating a world in which I was trying to correct things that I saw at that time as wrong in the current society in which I lived. And so I created a world in which there was no poverty. Uh, there was no war. I don't recall that there's any disease. All the things that were a source of problems in the society in which I lived, I got rid of and created this world that on the surface seemed perfect. And one of the things I did was create gender equality. The parents in the book, the mother is a judge of some sort, and the father is a child care worker. And you know, in our world today, a child care worker is very, very poorly paid and not highly respected. But in the book, they have equal status in the community. And so I was consciously trying to address those things in that book. I do remember, though, that in the original version of the book, before it went through a revision process with an editor, there was reference to same-sex couples. I think that may have been the first, if not the only book in which I have included such a reference. And the editor asked me to take it out. And so I did. And I think the reason was probably accurate. It would have been at that time a distraction from what the book was trying to say. It would have been another avenue that we didn't need to go down at that point. So I did take that reference out.
So when you create these like for instance, in The Giver, as you mentioned, it's a world with gender equality. But in the following books in the quartet, the societies there have much more structured gender roles, such as in Gathering Blue and in the community that Claire visits in Sun. What's your motivation for giving these different types of gender dynamics?
Well, it's interesting. I've written those so long ago, and I haven't reread them lately, so it's hard for me to recall specifically. I am, however, working on a new book right now, which is also set in the future. Uh, so I guess I try to avoid thinking up or thinking of issues and specifically addressing them, uh, because it then seems to me that a book that does that ends up feeling somewhat contrived. So I try to create a world when I when I write a book, whether it's a world in the future or in the past. I've done, books set long ago. In fact, one of my books is set in the Iron Age, so quite a long time ago. Uh, and one of my books is set in the time of my mother's childhood, in the early 1900s. So each time I do that, creating a world, an imaginary world, oh, I've forgotten where I was going with that statement. But I just try to move into it, to inhabit it, to describe it. But it arises within me and within my imagination, kind of intuitively. I don't make a list of, although I did for The Giver, I made a list of the stuff I wanted to get rid of in order to create that society. But that's rare. Usually I just move into a world that I begin uh, to understand as it takes place. I don't consciously create it. Maybe it would be easier if I did so, because sometimes it gets hard. And in fact, the book I'm working on now, I'm working on revisions, and I'm having to go back and create a timeline. When did this happen? When did that happen? And if I were organized and used index cards, I would have known that when I wrote it instead of having to go back and deal with it now. But I don't consciously think of those things. They permeate my awareness without my setting them out in a conscious fashion.
So as you probably know, The Giver and I think Number of the Stars are typically required reading for middle schoolers. How do you think these sorts of different dynamics and differences in children's books, if not your own, have influence young readers?
Well, I think there has been a very conscious attempt in recent years to address not only gender issues, but cultural issues, um, to find and publish more writers of color or ethnicity. And that's been a good thing. Because when in my childhood, uh, the books I read were all about white females. And that was true to a certain degree with the books that my own children read. And my children are in their 60s now. So I think this has been a long overdue and welcome change. However, it leaves me as a white female, uh, um, the characters who come into my imaginative process are generally characters like me. And in fact, I did write a book several years ago in which one of the main characters was a Black female. She was 14. There were two main characters. There was a white 18-year-old boy and a Black girl. There was no, they were strangers to each other, but they found themselves in a circumstance where they were in great danger, and they had to work together and help each other in order to survive. Um, and it was a book. I don't remember what year I wrote it, but the publisher gave it to what they call sensitivity readers because one of the main characters was Black and I am not. And they deemed it, the sensitivity readers, who were nameless, I don't know who they were, deemed it cultural appropriation. And so the book was never published. Um, I would take issue with that, but that's just me. So it's something that I am now always aware of. And yet it could be extended if I were to write now, write a book in which a boy is the main character. That could be deemed appropriation of gender, I suppose. But it seems to me that's the role of the writer to be able to enter the consciousness of an other person. At least that's what I've always taken my role to be. I'm sorry, I'm looking out my window. There's a bright red cardinal on a bush. Uh, so I tend not to think about it a lot, and yet I unconsciously, when I start out writing a book, I almost, without exception, find myself in the voice of a female character. Young, because I write for young people, the main character always has to be young. I'm aware as I tell you this, though, that the book I'm currently working on has two main characters and they're fraternal twins and they're boy and girl. So I am grappling there with both genders. Although the distinctions, I'm still in the midst of this book, so I haven't thought it through carefully. But at any rate, there it is.
On a somewhat related note, I know that you have four grandchildren. If they were of the right age, were any of them assigned The Giver as reading in middle school?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think, well, I have four grandchildren, but only one is a granddaughter, and she happens to have been born and has grown up in Germany. So she's been through their educational system, and I don't think they assign the giver. Although, interestingly, they do use Number the Stars in Germany because they have mandated Holocaust education there, which speaks well for that country, I think. But my three grandsons all had to read The Giver in school. And one who went to a boarding school, a prep school, had me come and speak to his class about The Giver. So it's just kind of amusing for them, I think, more than anything else. Gives them a little
What
prestige.
what was it like for you to have your grandchildren required to read a book that you wrote, and did they like it?
I think they all liked it. Um, I remember my two youngest grandsons are 25 and 27 now. They're brothers. And I remember that when the movie of The Giver was being made, they had an opportunity to watch it in advance with me. So that was kind of fun. Um, I don't know, I've never really talked to them about the book itself. But I think they've all, they've gotten a little mileage out of having what seems briefly to be a celebrity grandmother for that week that they're reading The Giver in school.
Um, so many popular dystopian series, such as The Hunger Game and the Divergent series, were written by female authors, and of course, you wrote The Giver. Why do you think so many of these series were authored by women?
I don't know the answer to that. And I also don't, I have not kept up with, I tend not to read other books for young adults, partly because I think, well, I can't make a blanket statement, but for myself, I like to read a book with a main character to whom I can relate. So I read books about adults because I'm an adult. Uh, so I've not kept up with what's being published for young adults. And is that, and maybe you don't know the answer to this either, but is it true that most dystopian young adult fiction has been written by women?
I don't know about most. I just know that those two are very
Yeah.
popular and that they were written by women.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that, but it may be, and this is going to be a maybe a sexist remark, I guess, but maybe it's women who think more about what the world could be like or might be like. Maybe it's women who, more than men, worry about the world that our children and grandchildren will grow up in. I don't know that that's true, but it could be one reason why it's women who turn their attention to that kind of fiction.
So, over the course of your life, you were born in the 1930s and now you're here in the 2020s. What's the biggest difference you've seen for women throughout that time?
I think the biggest difference for women occurred when my own daughters were coming of age, as it were. Uh, the freedom that they've had to do whatever they want, which I didn't feel that I had. Maybe wrongly didn't feel that. Uh, so and you know that one daughter opted not to go to college, and that seemed okay. Wasn't for her. She's found a life doing other things. One daughter couldn't quit going to college. She got 3 different master's degrees in different fields. So, but they all had that freedom that women of my generation, I don't think felt that we had. We felt in my generation a pressure to marry. And I think that's an enormous difference now. My granddaughter, my only granddaughter, is a teacher now in Germany, where she grew up. She got a master's in linguistics, and she speaks 5 languages, and she teaches languages in the German school system. Uh, she just announced her engagement. She's going to be married next summer, but she's 32. She's lived with this guy for 10 and a half years, and I haven't asked her why they decided to marry. But she's had that freedom not to. It never occurred to me in the past 10 and a half years. I've known this because she's brought him to the States in the summer, and I've met him many times. And it never occurred to me to say to her, why don't you get married? But my parents would have said that to my generation. So I think that's an enormous change, the lack of pressure to marry. I have a step I have to think of the nomenclature here. I have a step granddaughter who is now transitioning to grandson. I mean, that's something that would never have happened in 2 generations ago, or even one. It would have been unusual. Now it's not yet ho hum, but it's accepted. I have a gay grandson who came out when he was in high school. And his parents, my son and his wife, were like, "Oh, what else is new?" I mean, it was not an issue, and that's been, I think, the greatest change. And it's very frightening to see the conservative backlash coming now that may destroy some of what we've acquired and earned.
So thinking about when you went to Brown, in another interview, you explained that back when you were in college at that time, you said we called ourselves girls then, not women. Can you elaborate on what that means to you?
Yeah, and I'm just thinking of something else that happened when I was in Brown. And let me tell you this first, otherwise I'll forget it. At Brown, when I was a student there, the freshman women were housed in houses that had been purchased by the university. So it had once been a private home. And so I was in a house in a dorm with, I don't know, maybe there were 7 bedrooms. And so that group of, we called ourselves girls, that group of young women became very close friends and became a little community of our own. And there was one woman in our small dorm when I was a freshman. She was from Vermont, I remember, and she was very unlike the rest of us. And I don't know what her real first name was, but her nickname and what we all called her was Mike. And she didn't care anything about clothes. Uh, we all spent a lot of time worrying about how many cashmere sweaters we had. And Mike wore jeans and boots, army boots. And we all liked her just fine, but we didn't include her in our female doings. And we kind of excluded her, not out of cruelty, but because we didn't feel a kinship with her. She was different from us, and we weren't sure what the difference was, but I think we excluded her from our friendships. And many years later, it was some anniversary, say 25 years later, there was a questionnaire that we all filled out, and then they printed up a little booklet. And there were questions we had answered. And one was, what do you remember most fondly from your years at Brown? And she had responded to the questionnaire. And she said, I don't have any fond memories. I wasn't very happy when I was there. And in her personal information, as she said, she now lives with her partner, Helen, and they do a lot of hiking together, whatever. And and when I read that and thought about her and remembered her, I felt a great sadness, a great regret, shame, really. And I was going to write her a letter and apologize for. We hadn't treated her badly, but we just hadn't included her in our group. But before I could write the letter, the Brown Alumni Magazine published her obituary, and she had died. So I've always felt a great regret about that. And now you had asked a question, which I was going to answer, but I've forgotten what it was.
Um,
Oh,
so you
girls versus women. Okay. We had been brought up to think of ourselves as girls and girly, and we still thought of ourselves that way. And we didn't feel at that time grown up yet. We felt unfinished, I think. Maybe I can only speak for myself. And I think women sort of had an adult connotation that we didn't feel ready to apply to ourselves. I don't think any of that was conscious thinking, but the word women had not yet come to mean young women. Women were our mothers and our grandmothers, and we were still girls. And in retrospect, I regret that because we were working hard at being something other than girls, but we still called ourselves that.
so we began our interview with me describing you as an author, photographer, and inspiration. How would you describe yourself?
If called upon to describe myself, I guess I would always put writer first because it's what I most value about myself. And it's what what I'm most passionate about doing. I live alone. My husband died just last month. Um, and it would be very easy for me to become a recluse, which I'm working hard at not becoming, because I'm an introvert, because I like being alone, because my passionate life is between me and my computer and the words that I put into it, and that's what I most enjoy doing. So writer would be first, and in a way that demeans my children because mother would certainly be right up there. But I no longer feel like mother in the sense of taking care of or bringing up. My children are adults. My grandchildren are adults. So motherhood, incidentally, today is Monday, and every Monday at 2 o'clock, I have a Zoom with my two daughters. One's in San Francisco, one's in New Hampshire. And we love just getting together and talking, and we reminisce a lot. But it's not like mom and the girls. It's like three women talking to each other. I think that's fair to say, and I think they would agree with that. So, mother is an important part of my identity, but writer is to me a more important part.
So looking back on all that you've experienced and achieved, what makes you most proud of your younger self?
Well, I think probably in retrospect, the fact that I had an ambition which I curtailed for a while, but that I kept it there and that I pursued it eventually, that I didn't give up on it. And it was not easy. And I hung in there and I made some stupid mistakes along the way, but I guess I'm proud that I persevered and that I was able eventually to be who I wanted to be.
So as we close our interview, thank you for sharing your story with me and our audience. It was a pleasure to hear your story, and I'm excited about the impact your story will have. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Trinity. It's been fun.